Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. I want to thank you for viewing my presentation today, and also a big thanks to the Summer Festival 1455 for having me here and sharing my story, my family stories, and how they inspired my two historical novels. So I'm going to get started here. I'm going to do a share screen and share my PowerPoint. All right, and let me do this in this mode here. So I'm going to talk about, I have two novels. One of them, Barefoot Dreams of Petra, came out last year. And then I have an upcoming novel called The Other Side of the River that's coming out this September. And it's a follow-up to Barefoot Dreams of Petra. And both stories were inspired by historical events, and also mainly by stories from my family stories that I heard. And let me see, I'll show you here. See if this is moving. These are stories that were inspired mainly by my great grandmother. She's the one that had all these stories of having lived through the Mexican Revolution back in 1913. And a lot of those stories were passed down to my grandmother, and my grandmother passed them down to my mother, who passed them down to me. So that's my great grandmother in the center here, and then my grandmother to the right, and then my mother and myself when I was younger. And ever since that age, I've always liked listening to stories. And I could tell young readers, even though the story may sound, boring because it's the same one, there's always new details to learn from these stories. And a lot of the stories I heard from my family were about the way they lived. So both my grandmother and great grandmother were very, very poor people. They lived in, this is a typical home they lived in. They lived in a hut. And these huts were constructed out of adobe blocks, made out of mud. So these blocks were formed or stacked up to build this one room house. And as you can tell, it's got no windows. It's got one door, and the roof, it's a thatch roof. So this is exactly how in the stories it was described to me. And not until I started doing the research did I come across these actual pictures, photographs from historical photographs. And something else I found out through the research that verified a lot of the family stories were of the children, older siblings having to raise younger ones. And this is something that I could relate to from my family stories as well, because my great grandmother's mother died during childbirth. And this is something that was fairly common back then. And like I tell young readers, you think about women nowadays, if a woman's pregnant, she goes to the hospital to have a baby, and if there are any complications, there's a technology there and professionals to help her with the complications. But back then, people had babies in the huts, and so mothers dying during childbirth was fairly common. And in a lot of the photographs and a lot of the family stories I heard, it was always about older siblings taking care of younger ones. And other stories I heard were about the work, the grueling work children had to endure. And for instance, my grandmother, she got her first job when she was about 4.5, 5 years old. And she said it was a local rancher who had hired her. And that local rancher had about 40, 50 goats. And it was my grandmother's job to take care of those goats. So every morning she had to get up really early, go to the corral, take out those goats, take them to the creek to drink water, take them to the pastures to feed, and then take them back to the corral. She had to do this 3 times a day, and she had to do this every day. It didn't matter if it was hot, cold, it was raining, anything, that was her job. And she talked about one time that she took out the goats and there was this ice storm approaching and temperatures were dropping quickly. So she had to gather the goats to take them back to the corral to safety. But she said a lot of the goats didn't want to move because they're already cold. And she's struggling. She's almost 5 years old. She's struggling to get these goats together. And one in particular didn't want to move, this big goat. And she describes how she's pushing this big goat. She's near a creek. And as she's trying to push it, she falls into the creek. And she's able to get out. But at that moment, she's soaking wet. And she manages to get these goats together and take them back to the corral. And she said that in her mind, even though she's 4.5, 5 years old, she knew she had to keep these goats safe, because if one of them died or one of them got lost, she would be fired. And she knew that meant there would be no money and no money to buy food, which her family desperately needed. So she manages to get the goats together, puts them in the corral. By the time she shuts the gate, she can't feel her fingers anymore. And as soon as that gate's shut, she knows the goats are safe and she collapses just out of the exhaustion. And they told her it took them another 3-4 hours before they found her. But it just lets you know the conditions that children had to endure back then just to help the family stay afloat. And she said by the time she was 12 years old, she would climb trees, chop wood, and she would strap it to her back, kind of like this girl here in the picture in the left. And she would go to the village and sell that wood. And she said those were good days when there was work to be done, that when there was money to be paid, because it was terrible when you would, go house to house trying to get work and there was none. And that's when starvation would start and times would get really, really grim. So those are a lot of the stories that I heard of. And something I want to see if I could see if you kind of what I've talked about, see if you could come to a number here. It's a little quiz time that I have for audience engagement here. So if you think about the kids have to work. For instance, my great grandmother and my grandmother both had to work. They didn't have time for school. And a lot of children were like this in Mexico. So knowing this, having this in mind, if you think about Mexico back in 1913, what percentage of the population do you think was able to read and write during that time? And if you want to take a guess, and I'll give you 3 seconds and then I'll put up the answer. All right, here we go. So it's 20%. 20%, it's not that much. 20% of the population back in Mexico in 1913 was literate, but that means 80% could not read or write. And that's a big chunk of the population that is illiterate. And I always tell our readers, if a society has that many people that are not educated, you're bound to have problems later on in the future. So it's something to keep in mind. And other disparities my family stories described were just like I showed you the hut on the outside. This is the way it looked on the inside. My great grandmother described that they had no furniture, no chairs, no tables, couches, beds. Everything was down on the floor. You slept on the floor, they sat on the floor, they cooked on the floor. And it was an earthen floor, they had no carpet, no wood. It was just the dirt. And that's the way it was. So I always try to show the opposite side. How did the rich people live during that time? And I love it when I do presentations for children, when I show them the extremes. And now I'll show you how the rich people lived during that time. So these beautiful homes here these are the haciendas during that time. And these haciendas were these large land estates. There were thousands and thousands of acres. And this hacienda was owned by one family, the hacendados. And some haciendas were so large, for instance, the Terrazas family that lived in northern Mexico, their hacienda was so large that they said it was the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island put together. So that was just one hacienda. It was just this massive amount of land. And the haciendas had these lands where they would cultivate. They would have farming, they would have crops. And of course, they hired peasants to grow the crops. And at the end of the month, the peasants would get paid by the hacendados, by the hacienda family. But in order for the peasant to buy things for their family, medicine, food, anything they needed at the end of the month, they had to go to the hacienda store because everything else was so far away. And the haciendas were, like I said, they were so large that they were their own communities. They had their own church, their own stores. So the peasant would go to the hacienda store to buy his goods. And when the peasant first would go into the store, he'd gather what he needed for his family, but he was never paid enough to afford what he needed for his family. But the hacienda store would say, no big deal. You could take what you need, but we'll take this notebook, we'll write your name on it and put how much you owe us. And next month comes along, then you pay us what you owe us and we'll be even. So it would happen again next month. The next month, the peasant would get paid. The hacienda family would send them to, he would go to the hacienda store to buy the goods. And again, he couldn't afford it. He couldn't even afford what he owed the month before. So the hacienda family I'm sorry, the hacienda store would again give them the credit and tell them, again, it's more that you owe us. And the peasant couldn't quit, or the mine worker couldn't quit at that moment and say, all right, I'm going to another hacienda, I'm going elsewhere. They couldn't if they owed money. As long as they owed money, they were bound to that hacienda. And some people lived all their lives in the hacienda. They were teenagers there, they were adults, and went to their senior years and died having this massive amount of debt to the hacienda. And a lot of times when that person died, that debt was passed on to the family members. So a lot of young people who were pretty close to paying off their debts couldn't leave because they had a relative who had passed away, and now they inherited that debt. But it was just a system, for the hacienda to keep you there and not let you leave. And some people wanted to run away. Some people thought about doing that and attempted it, but you see these gentlemen here outside in the patio of the hacienda. They're the ones wearing the tall sombreros. Those were called rurales. And the rurales were the mounted police. And if somebody ran away, the hacendados would send the rurales to go after that person. And they would go capture them, bring them back to the hacienda, punish them, and put them back to work. So that pretty much was the life of the peasant in the hacienda. And this is what I learned from my family stories. And other photographs I came across, like this one during the research, this one spoke to me so much because in my family stories, I also learned about the disparities between the rich and the poor and how those two classes interacted. So here in this photograph, you have these 4 women wearing silk. And you see this woman and child walking opposite direction, and they're wearing ragged clothes. They have their shawls, they're barefoot, just like my grandmother and great grandmother would have been dressed. And as they're walking, they're passing each other. You see this woman, she's tucking in her skirt, and she's giving them a glance. And there was so much from that photograph, that glance that they're giving this poor woman and child, that all these family stories of how my grandmother, my great grandmother were treated by upper class society, they all came to me. So this photograph actually inspired a scene in the first book. So I believe it's chapter 2. If you read that, you'll recognize where that scene came from, and it came from this photograph. Bare feet, I saw that a lot in many photographs, and in majority of my family stories, everybody was always barefoot, including my mother. And it's just because shoes were so expensive. They were luxury, just like they are now. But again, we take things for granted. But back then, it was the same thing, very expensive. Kids outgrow their shoes so quickly, so they couldn't afford them. And it's something I saw in the research photographs as well. And stories of courage and dreams. My grandmother and great grandmother, but more so my grandmother, had the dream of learning to read and write. And both women could not attend school because they had to work. But my grandmother, at the age of 9, she promised herself that she was going to figure out a way to learn how to read and write. And she made it her mission, her goal. And anybody she knew that knew how to read it or write a little bit, she would ask them, what does this word say? What does that word say? And within 3 years, by the time she was 12, she had figured it out on her own. So to this day, it blows my mind how a child, could be that determined and be able to achieve something like that. And I wanted to give that to the character in my book as well, Petra Luna. I wanted to give her that same dream. And the courage, all the stories I heard from my family were full of courage, because despite the poverty that surrounded them, these women, they walked with their heads held high. They were not ashamed of who they were, and always were proud, of the hard work they did, and they valued themselves despite what society told them or wanted them to be like. They went above that. They rose above that, and that's something that, again, it encouraged me to put that into the story. So one more quiz here. Now that you know about haciendas, how haciendas have these massive amounts of land, how powerful they are, and how rich they are. Think about Mexico. Again, it's 1913. what percentage of the population do you think owned land back then? So take a guess, because in the quiz before for the literacy, we said that 20% of people were literate in Mexico. So now we want to know landowners, how many people own land, what percentage? So I'm going to give you 3 seconds, and then I'll put the answer up here. All right. So it's 1%. Only 1% of the population in Mexico own land. And when I saw this statistic, it blew my mind away. I couldn't believe it, that 99% of Mexicans back in 1913 could not afford land. It was just so expensive. So people are wondering, okay, what happened? Well, what was happening that people could not afford land? And you think about the haciendas, the haciendas are becoming very powerful, very rich, because some of them not only do they have crops that, they harvest, but some of them have copper, or they have silver, gold in their land, and that just, multiplies their wealth. So a lot of their money, they were giving it to the Mexican government. And the Mexican government, of course, was growing more powerful as well. And in turn, they would give land to the haciendas to give them more power. But where was that land coming from? Who were they taking it away? They were taking it away from the poor. And for them, it was easy to take it away from the poor because, remember, they're uneducated, they're illiterate. So any document they would present to them to sign, they couldn't read it. So they would sign any document, and a lot of the times they were giving up their lands. And also, if they didn't know how to read or write, many times in Mexico, if you couldn't sign your name, you would just mark an X or a cross at the bottom. So anybody could forge that, and land were just taken away fast by, from everyone and given to the rich. So it came to a point that my great-grandmother said that people were so fed up with the abuse, with the oppression of land being taken away this way, the corruption, the lack of opportunities for children to go to school, advance, or get any type of education, that people just, were done. And that's what eventually led the Mexican Revolution to come about, when people demanded change. And that's something that my great-grandmother described. And when I turn to young readers, because these are both novels that are geared for, mainly for a younger audience, I try to convey to them, because it's kind of hard for children sometimes to understand the dynamics of a revolution. So the best way that I do is I ask them if they're familiarized with Star Wars, and majority, tell me, yeah, they're familiarized with Star Wars. So I always use the Star Wars setup to explain the revolution. I tell them about the evil empire. I tell them, the evil empire, and of course they say yes. I say, well, think of that as a Mexican government. They're in control. They have all the power. So the Mexican government's in power, but instead of having stormtroopers fighting for them, they have the federales. The federales is a Mexican army that fights for them. And at the other end, you have the rebels. And the rebels in Mexico are called revolucionarios. And they're the ones who are seeking to get the lands back. They're seeking rights and opportunities for their kids, for their children. But I tell them that it's complicated. It's a war. And you can say that all the federales were evil, because a lot of federales, a lot of the men in the Mexican army did not want to be part of the federales. A lot of them were conscripted. So, it's very complicated, and that's something I try to explain to young readers. But this war, this revolution is very unique in the sense that it affected everybody in the country, and men and women, especially women and children, a lot of them didn't stay in the towns. A lot of them followed their husbands, whether they were fighting for the federales or they were the rebels, they would follow them. And many of them lived their lives above, on top of trains, literally. So as the train was driving to from one battlefield to another, women cooked and did all their chores, mended clothes, men trained young boys how to load weapons and clean weapons, and everything was done on top of that train. So it's very interesting how people adapted, to fight this war. And something interesting about children during the war too is that when they turned 12, the children were allowed to join the rebels. And it didn't matter if they were boys or girls, as long as they were 12 years old. And once they joined, they were treated as soldiers. Now they were no longer treated as children, they were treated as soldiers, they were paid, they were trained. And many of the kids were trained as spies. And they were sent to the other side to listen, to gather intel. And they easily blended because they're children, they're playing around, nobody notices them. And as soon as they gathered enough intel, they would come back to the rebels and tell them what they heard. And many battles were won that way because of children bringing that intel. And also the Mexican Revolution was one of the first wars that had women achieve really, really high ranks, which hadn't been heard of in military history before. You had women becoming captains and generals, and one general woman, for instance, she had 500 troops under her command, both men and women. And this was unheard of before this. But my great-grandmother, she was 9 years old, and she couldn't join the rebels because she's 9, she's not 12. And her father, they were trying to conscript the father. The federales were coming to the town and they were trying to conscript men and boys. So the federales they would invade towns and they would conscript men and boys as young as 8 years old. So if you were 8 years old boy or older, they would conscript you. So as soon as people knew the federales were coming over, they would flee. They would flee the towns, and the federales would come and attack the town and burn it down and go after the people who were invading them. So that's what happened to my great-grandmother. They fled the town. And I always ask people, imagine that they're attacking your subdivision, your neighborhood, they're about to burn your house, and you have 30 seconds to grab something. What would you grab in those 30 seconds, knowing that you might never come back to that home? And if you do come back, it might be burned. So in my research, I found many photographs, and this one's the one that tugged in my heart, the one on the right, because this lady's carrying her puppy, her dog. And I saw many photographs like this with people carrying their pets, and they knew they were going to be marching across the desert, but still, they carried their pets, knowing that, because that's what they cherish the most. And so my great-grandmother crossed the desert in northern Mexico. This is the map, and she was in the state of Coahuila and near the mountains, and her family fled and they crossed the desert. So what my great-grandmother explained was that their goal was to reach the border. And once they reached the border, they wanted to cross that river, the Rio Grande, or known as the Rio Bravo in Mexico. They wanted to cross it because they knew that the federales who are after them, they knew the federales wouldn't dare cross that border, because if they did cross the border, the US would see that as an invasion. And if they saw that as an invasion, they would declare war against Mexico. And Mexico didn't want a war with the United States. They had their own war. So people knew that the federales, they would stop right before the border. So that was everybody's aim, to make it to the border and cross. So my great-grandmother said they reached the city of Piedras Negras in Mexico, which is a border city, sister city to Eagle Pass, Texas. And this is the way the bridge looks now. This is the way it looked back then. And she said that they reached the bridge and started walking across it. And when they got halfway, they couldn't go beyond that halfway point, because there were these two gates that were closed and they were locked. And on the other side of those gates were 2 US Army soldiers, and they were holding rifles, not letting anybody through. So my great-grandmother said that her father told her, okay, let's wait, perhaps they'll open it tomorrow. Let's go back to the town and we'll sleep there and come back the next day. So they did that. They slept on the sidewalks, and they went the next day. Still, that gate is closed, and those American soldiers are still standing guard there with weapons. So they head back to the town, and it's getting more crowded. People are arriving more at the border. It's raining during certain periods, and people are sleeping in the sidewalk. And people still believe they have time. They believe they had 5 to 6 days before the federales would arrive there. That was what people have been told. And on the third day, they go find out to see if that bridge had been opened. And still, it's closed. That gate is locked. So my great-grandmother said that her father told her, let's just wait near the entrance of the bridge. We'll sit here. And if they do open the gates, we're the first ones in. So they decided to wait there. They still have 2-3 more days. So they're growing a little more anxious. They don't have any food, and they're out in the elements all day. So they're waiting there when suddenly people start screaming. They start shouting that the federales are there. They made it to the town. So my great grandmother grabs her siblings, her father grabs the other siblings, and they run for the bridge. And everybody's running there. Now that narrow bridge is crowded with people trying to go to the other side, and those gates are still closed. And luckily, like I said, my great grandmother, they had been waiting near the entrance of the bridge. So she was close enough that she could see the gate that was locked. And everybody's pushing, they're shoving, they're pleading for their lives to the American soldiers. And she said she could see the American soldiers on the other side. Their faces are red, they're scrambling. She said you could tell they wanted to open the gates, but they had orders not to, so they're frustrated. And as they're shoving and pushing, people start screaming louder. And she turns to see what they're screaming about and realizes that everybody's looking at the Mexican side, and it's the federales. The federales are there. She could see them. They're up on the hill and they're charging down towards her. They're on horseback and they're coming. So she said she turns, that gate is still closed and people are just screaming. And she thought, this is it. I'm 9 years old. I'm trapped in this bridge and this is where I'm going to die, because she knew that the federales would get there and would slaughter them. But at that point, she turns to the American side and sees many American soldiers running towards the gate. They're screaming, they're shouting. And one of them quickly, locks the gate. They remove the chains and they just open that gate wide. And she said at that moment, she just grabbed her siblings and ran as fast as she could and crossed to the other side. And she said she felt this overwhelming joy as she crossed that bridge and reached the US soil. And when she put her siblings down, she said she felt so grateful. She wanted to go and hug every American soldier because she just was so thankful that they had let her in. And this is a story she told over and over. And every time she ended it, and even when my grandmother retold it and my mother, they always ended it with that gratefulness that she had for America for having letting them in at that time. And so I decided to write about this story. But before I jumped into that endeavor, I said, well, first, it's a family story. I want to find out, did it really happen? Was it true, or is it something that got stretched? So I decided to do some detective work, and I had my basic questions of who, what, where, when, why, how. Majority I answered from the story that I told you. The only thing I didn't know was the when. And by the time I was doing this, my great grandmother had passed already, but both my grandmother and my mom couldn't tell me when. They couldn't even give me a year. So I figured, okay, I'm gonna go to the library, get all these books on the Mexican Revolution, and I'm sure I'll find something about it there. And like I said, it was 40 books, English and Spanish. And it took me about a little over a year to read all those books. And I found absolutely nothing about that bridge. And it boggled me. It boggled my mind. I said, okay, how is it that, this little girl saw hundreds of people on that bridge pleading for their lives? And this is not in any of these books, what gives. And even one book that somebody recommended that talked about particular, events in Texas during the Mexican Revolution at the Texas border, did not mention it. So at that point, I wanted to give up. I said, you know what? This is a family story that probably got stretched. My great grandmother was 9 years old. Her memory probably, it has changed since, or maybe she exaggerated things. She was 9. She probably got spooked by a few federales she saw walking by. And it was just her and her family trying to cross a bridge. And I was about to put this whole project down when a librarian in Colorado mentioned this resource, and I'd never heard of it before. And he said, yeah, it's a resource that lets you see all the newspapers that have been published in Texas. So I said, that's great, that's wonderful, but when am I going to start? Right? I can't possibly read every single newspaper out there. So I went back to these books and I came up with this date. I said, okay, no, we'll start with November 20th, 1910, because that's the official start of the Mexican Revolution. So my great grandmother's event happened after the start of the state of the revolution. So I began reading newspapers that began, from that date and on. And it was fun. It was a lot of work, but it was like watching the news. I even saw advertisements, what people are wearing, what people are eating, announcements for debutantes, for parades, festivities. So it was pretty neat to see. And I also got knowledge about the Mexican Revolution, how it unfolded, with reporters giving daily reports about the war. And within 7 months, it took me 7 months when I finally came across this article here. And this was it. This was my great grandmother's story here. Everything she described about being in that Mexican border town, about them waiting for days for that bridge to open, about the Federales showing unexpectedly, everything was in there, even the pleading of their lives and whatnot, except she said it was hundreds of people, and it was actually thousands. It was almost 7,000 people that crossed the bridge that day. And now that I had a date, it was October 5th, 1913. So that from my detective work, now I had a date. So that opened up the door to more resources, and I found more material. And it turns out somebody had a camera during that event and snapped photographs. And the building you see here in the background, that's the municipal building in Mexico. And this bridge here is that old bridge I showed you, that international bridge. And all these people here are running for their lives. So somewhere in that crowd is my great grandmother running for her life. And you could even see the American soldier, the GI here, just the way she described their uniform is standing here. So to me, this was phenomenal to find something like this, a photograph that neither my grandmother or great grandmother had seen before, that it took another 100 years before someone in the family would see it. And I was wondering, even if this little girl up in the front, carrying siblings, I'm wondering, who knows, maybe that's my great grandmother there. And the story continues. So my great grandmother ended up at a refugee camp in Eagle Pass. And she said that after 5 weeks of being in that refugee camp, U.S. immigration came over and told the refugees that the refugee camp was about to shut, and told them they had either the choice to go back to Mexico because the Federales were gone, it was safe now. They could go back to Mexico, or they could stay in the United States. And if they remained in the United States, immigration would help them with employment, finding housing and stuff like that. So my great grandmother was 9. She was the oldest sibling. She and her father talked it over, and they decided to go back to Mexico. A lot of people did. So they decided to go back to Mexico. And she said that when they went back, everything was destroyed. It was just devastation everywhere. She said farm fields were burned, towns, villages were completely destroyed. So when I think back to those stories, I kind of envision what we see in Ukraine now, where you wonder, how are people going to get restarted again? And that's what she described to me. She said it took years before people were able to live, better lives than when they first arrived there. But a lot of people did remain in the United States. As a matter of fact, after the Mexican Revolution, 2 million people, Mexicans, made the United States their permanent home. So that was one of the biggest immigration waves from Mexico we had. And after that, it was like an anchor. We have subsequent immigration waves after that. First 2 million people came here. And it's something that impacted both America and Mexico in many ways. So I always wondered, what if my great grandmother had stayed in the United States instead of going back to Mexico? What would her life been like had she remained here? And in the research, when I read about what refugees went through in Texas and throughout the United States, I wanted to put my character in Texas. So I ended up putting her in San Antonio. And I'm biased. I like San Antonio. I grew up in San Antonio, but San Antonio back then had a population of 100,000. And within a span of a year or two, they had 30,000 refugees. So that was a 30% increase in population. And that changed the city forever. So San Antonio is the way it is now because of that influx of immigrants. And I have Petra Luna being in that city for this next book, The Other Side of the River, which comes out this September. And San Antonio, they had the west side of San Antonio became known as Little Mexico or Los Corrales. And now, if you go to San Antonio, you hear a lot of Spanish speaking people, and it's just because, like I said, it's a continuous wave of immigration that began during the Mexican Revolution. So this is my family story, and I'm always urging people to find their own histories, because there's so many things we learn from stories, from family stories. I feel like it's tiny little fragments and puzzles that make us whole. And we learn more about ourselves. We learn why we see the world in the way we see it. And a lot of we don't realize how much of an impact our ancestors have in the way we live and the way we see things. And also shedding light. There are many stories out there that we need to bring out to the light. For instance, my great-grandmother, the way, she crossed a bridge, and that story of survival. There are many stories out there of survival that we need to reach out and bring out so that we can learn more about them. And also, history repeats itself. It tends to repeat itself. So here on the left, we have the Mexican Revolution, photographs from that era. On the right, we have recent photographs from only a few weeks or months ago. These photographs are, over 100 years apart. But if you look at the people in both photographs, you see that everyone's walking up the tracks towards the United States. You see the despair, you see the exhaustion in their bodies and their faces. So it's something that is happening again, people escaping violence and seeking refuge up north or elsewhere. You see that even in Europe right now, with the problems going in Ukraine, and how we saw people migrating, leaving that violence in their homeland behind to seeking refuge elsewhere. That border that I showed you earlier that my great-grandmother crossed, this is the exact same border on the right. Again, 100 years apart, but we have crisis again. So things repeat themselves. It happens again. The refugee camps, like the one my great-grandmother was in, we have refugee camps now. And what's interesting is right now we have COVID. Back then, they had smallpox. And when my great-grandmother first crossed the border with those 7,000 people in the town of Eagle Pass were really upset. They were afraid. They were afraid that there was going to be an outbreak of smallpox. So they immediately said, no, we want those refugees sent back. We can't have an outbreak in this town. But the US Army intervened and said, no, we'll put them in a parade field. We'll quarantine the ones that are sick. We'll vaccinate everybody else, and we'll keep it under control. And luckily for my great-grandmother, they were not sent back. But it's interesting how you see things happening again. Those disparities from the picture I showed you earlier, the disparities, the gap between the ultra-rich and the impoverished, you see that happening more and more. You see that gap growing wider around the world and here in the United States as well. But people always come together to help. So this is San Antonio, the market square. People are gathering food to help the refugees. You see that happening here in Texas, elsewhere around the world, like Poland and all these countries they're helping refugees. So people always come together. There's always that hope. And I always tell readers, but especially young readers, to consider the losses when people don't share their stories, when we don't seek these stories either. It's just a tragedy when this is a photograph I found in my research, and I just fell in love with the eyes of this woman. Just there's so much wisdom and so many stories and experiences behind those eyes. So I always tell readers, seek these stories, whether if you see people like this, family members, neighbors, get these stories, because if we don't have if these people do not share their stories and they pass away, these stories are gone, they're gone and never to be brought back again. That's it, they disappear, they vanish forever. And there's just so much knowledge that we could gain from these stories. I do have a website where I show resources for the books, for the younger readers, that shows a timeline, a glossary for the Spanish words that are in there. And I also have a fact or fiction, whether, because it's a historical fiction book, but a lot of it was based on real things that happened to my great grandmother and my grandmother. So I have that breakdown there as well. And I also provide music, because I mentioned a lot of songs throughout the book that were popular in the Mexican Revolution. So I put that playlist as well on my website. And a lot of what's interesting are the lyrics, because a lot of the lyrics were created during that era. So you learn a lot about the revolution because of the lyrics and the style of music. I also have a newsletter where I give insights about the stories behind the scenes that you could also sign up for. And I do have my website is alldepicted.com. This is my email address. Since this is not an interactive session, if you have any questions about the research, about the book, anything like that, or if you want to share a family story, I love when people do that, when they reach out to me and share their family story, because I've learned so much from hearing from people, from readers. Feel free to email me, contact@alldepicted.com. You can follow me on Instagram. I have posts there that have old photographs, kind of like the ones I showed you, and follow the Mexican Revolution. And you could also follow me on Facebook as well. I have those pictures there as well. And I'm going to show you the book trailer so you could get a sense of this of the book. I'm going to see if I could do this smoothly here. Let me see. Share screen. Files. All right. Okay, desktop. Okay, here we go. Okay, it's coming to be easier here. All right, here we go. All right. All right. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening. And again, like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, email me. I'm always happy to interact with readers, or if you have a book club, because I've had this book read by children, and I've also had several senior citizen homes read the book too for the book club. So I love, that big range in ages that read the book. So feel free to do that. Contact me, and thank you again, 1455, for having me here tonight. And you have a wonderful evening. Keep in touch. And again, it's Barefoot Dreams with Petra Luna and The Other Side of the River, which will be out this September. Thank you. Have a good evening.